We have kind of explored what the tragedy of the commons is. It's time to start thinking about what to do about this tragedy, or what we might be able to do about this tragedy, or the alternatives that exist to address tragedies like this. Of course, that's the whole ball of wax. We're not really concerned with sheep harvesting. We're concerned with situations that emerge that are like this. Okay. So in my notes, I have two solutions. But you know what? I think I'm going to revise that. I'm going to offer up an alternative that's always present in public policy, and that is to do nothing. Because even in giving this example, I can't help but think to myself, as many of you I'm sure did, well, if it's always been that way, why would the problem emerge now? Right? Like, if it's been this way for thousands of years, how come all of a sudden the incentive became to destroy the common resource? It generally doesn't. So the reason I'm suggesting that doing nothing is an alternative is because sometimes private actors do just work together or self-regulate and address these situations before they become perhaps like what we could say too bad. An example that comes to my mind is one that in doing these classes online, I've seen a number of people point out in our discussion boards, just the little conversations we have. And I'm referring to things like toilet paper and cleaning supplies during the coronavirus quarantine. So I think it's well understood that these were things that there was a shortage of in the spring of 2020 when basically the economy shut down, except for some stores selling things like groceries um, for the coronavirus. And a very hard thing to find was toilet paper, which is, my wife had immediately pointed out, it's kind of funny because it's not a gastrointestinal virus. But people didn't want to be without toilet paper. Um, so it disappeared from the shelves. Now, as I'm saying that out loud, I'm thinking, again, like it's kind of funny, but think about it in terms of the tragedy of the commons. And maybe I'm overextending this. Maybe I'm being too imaginative, but I don't think so, because I participated in it in this manner. See, I went to the store as I saw things shutting down, and I heard first word of the difficulty in finding toilet paper, and I thought, well, I don't want to be without toilet paper. And I'm a bit of a doomsday prepper by nature anyway, so I was okay. I had, I don't remember how much, but I was okay. Our household wasn't desperate, but I thought, I don't want to be not okay. So when there was toilet paper on the shelf, I bought it just because I knew other people were doing that and I didn't want to be the one without. So think that through in the context of our tragedy of the commons. If I'm buying something up because you're going to be buying something up and the other person is going to be buying it up and it's going to go away, what does that lead to? Because each of you, other people, and I'm sharing this because I'm sure some of you did the same thing or something similar. You probably just said, I know you didn't think about it this way. Thinking about it this way will make you nuts. That's what economics is about. No. When we got into this situation where I'm buying toilet paper precisely because everybody's buying toilet paper and I don't want to be the one without it, that's a tragedy of the commons in a sense. One application for the tragedy of the commons is the nuclear arms race of the 20th century. You wanted to have more weapons than the other folks had because you didn't want to fall behind. But by everyone in the world having more weapons, everyone was worse off. You don't want to be without toilet paper, so you buy toilet paper just in case somebody else is going to be buying toilet paper, and they're buying toilet paper just in case you're buying toilet paper. And what the outcome ultimately is that there's no more toilet paper. It's a similar situation. It's also, we could apply the toilet paper thing to something called the prisoner's dilemma. It's similar there too. And that's the point of doing this, is that these things can be applied broadly. But the reason the toilet paper comes to mind, going back to what I said about the alternatives to address the tragedy of the commons, is because there was a period of time where you couldn't get toilet paper, but the stores stepped in and limited the quantity that could be purchased per person. Typically, I think they said 2 items per person. And they did that on a voluntary sort of basis. And they're private actors. They didn't have to do that. There was no law that said stores had to limit how much toilet paper a person could get. And of course, each of us knew, for the most part, there are probably some people, you might know some people who bought 500 rolls of toilet paper or something like that. But each of us knew, maybe not to go too overboard. And the problem, there's toilet paper in stores now in October, and there was in September, there was in August. So the problem was relatively short-lived without really anything being done except for the private actors addressing the problem themselves. So that's always an alternative. May not be the best alternative, but it is an alternative. The other two alternatives, the ones that are currently in my notes, the first one is some form of collaboration, right? These folks can see this happening, and someone somewhere says, hey, let's do something about this. And once they have done that, once they have agreed to work together for their common well-being, as opposed to pursuing their self-interest for their common well-being, they have formed essentially, and we're going to explore these avenues, some form of a government, right? They've agreed to cooperate on some level for their shared interests rather than their individual self-interests. And one of our 10 principles of economics was that governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. When I discussed that, just to get us through chapter 1, I focus on patents because that's pretty generally understood. Okay, yeah, that works. And I say there's more, you got to hold off. This is the more part, okay? It's the chapter around common resources and externalities in which governments can sometimes prove market outcomes. It really kind of gets reinforced, okay? So an alternative to address this is to collaborate in one way or another. And how might they collaborate? They can come up with whatever works for them. One thing they could do is charge a tax. See, if right now there's no cost adding more sheep. So they might say something like, we're going to charge a tax of $10 per sheep, and with this money that we raise, we're going to go buy grass seed and fertilizer. Right? That does away with the brown, because now they have the money to do it. Right? Let me back up. Why would anybody else, as an individual, go out and spread grass seed and fertilizer? Because if you have good grass over here, say this household does that. They have great grass over here. Well, the herd is just going to migrate over there and eat it right up, aren't they? So they could, if they take on that cost, they don't derive the benefit themselves. They take on the cost, they pass the benefit around to everybody else. There's no reason to do that. But if everybody has to pay per sheep or something like that, a tax, then they have that collected money. They spread that around the commons, and everybody, the problem is mitigated. What would really mitigate the problem is if you could tax on how much a sheep ate or how destructive the sheep was in some way. And I don't know how you could do that with a sheep. Maybe there's some sheep that eat more than others and charge a higher rate for those sheep. I don't know. I don't know sheep. And that would be great because then to avoid paying the tax, each household would be encouraged to have a lesser destructive sheep. And the ones who didn't would still be paying into the tax, and you would be raising some money that way, but you wouldn't need as much money because you would be encouraging lesser destructive sheep. And that's something we'll explore more. The idea of taxing as close to the source as possible, source of destruction, is something we explore more in our discussion with externalities outright. Maybe this is a good chance to define externalities. See, what's an externality is where a third party bears some cost of a two-party transaction. So if this household goes out and buys another sheep, that's the two-party transaction. They put it out here. It makes everyone else worse off each time someone adds a sheep by going and getting another sheep. So because of the common resource, there's a tendency for there to be negative externalities like that. Okay, so that's a little bit about externalities. We're going to explore that as a separate topic anyway. So taxes are one, collaboration broadly is one of the alternatives. One alternative under that is taxes. Another alternative that requires collaboration is an interesting one. I mean, it's all very interesting, I know, but this is one I bet you hadn't thought of. You know, it could be that you say you have someone study it and you say, look, the land around the area, the common resource that we share, can sustain, just pick a number, 100 sheep. We know it can sustain 100 sheep, and no more. It could sustain less, but no more than 100 sheep. That's what it can take. And so you could set a quota of 100 sheep, but then you have to decide who gets to have how many. So one thing you could do is a simple quota system would be to say, everyone can have, if I have, how many do I have here? 6 households. Everyone can have, I don't want to divide, 100 doesn't divide evenly into 6, so divide it up evenly, and every third year you can have an extra sheep till that one dies or something like that to make it even 100. I shouldn't have picked that number, but I did. Or I should have drawn 5 or 10 households. But anyway, just divide it up evenly, set a quota, and you could do that. The trouble with that is it creates no incentive. Just the raw quota creates no incentive to do anything better. All you can do is put out your quota, your limited number of sheep, harvest them, and move on to something else. And there's no innovation to that. There's nothing. There's no forward movement for the betterment of oneself or the community. At least with the taxes, especially if you can tax the sheep, how much the sheep eats. Going back to the taxes again, you have some push for innovation to find sheep that don't eat as much or don't need as much to produce their wool, and that's how that drives innovation. Okay, but the straight quota drives no innovation. But what you can do related to a quota is say this area can sustain 100 sheep. So what we'll do is we'll have sheep permits, and we'll make 100 of them, and we'll find a way to distribute those sheep permits. Okay, and once you've done that, once you've established the 100 sheep and the 100 sheep permits, and you have some mechanism to enforce it that nobody's cheating and having sheep with unpermitted sheep, okay, once you have done that, you have remedied the tragedy of the commons. But there are aspects of that that can make it better still, okay? Because the tragedy of the commons goes away. There's no more overgrazing because you're limited. You got it figured out. You're going to be limited to the 100. So that takes care of the tragedy of the commons. But with these quotas, some aspects that can make things better still is to make them tradable, okay? Because what that means is people who value damaging the land more have to pay more to get the permits. Because especially, again, like the taxes, if you can attach the permit not just to the number of sheep, but if you could attach it to the amount of grass the sheep eats, that's real good, okay? Let me go back. So if these permits are tradable, maybe this household doesn't really want to have sheep, but since everybody has sheep and they have the common area, they do, but they're not really into sheep, So what they can do is, if they're given their share of permits, they can sell those permits because those permits are tradable and they have real economic value. So they can make money precisely by not harming the common resource. And maybe, like, I don't know, this house. Maybe this house, maybe somebody that lives here belongs to PETA. And they've always hated this whole process that the community has been doing, but they're vastly outnumbered by people who do. And they think it's wrong. They disapprove of this whole arrangement. They say no sheep, raise hemp. And, that's what they want to do. But this is what's going on around them, and they're vastly outnumbered by the other households. Well, with the permits, they can get their permits, and I'll explain what I mean by get in a minute. And if they want to, they don't have to use them. They could tear them up. They could do a protest move, tear them up in the middle of the town. And that's 3 or 4 sheep that won't be in the grazing area, however many permits they got, right? They're free to do that. They're free to raise the money to buy the permits to do that, if that's what they want to do, because they have the permit to do it. So that it adds that value. The tradable permits option adds that value. Um, Another aspect of the tradable permits option is how they're originally distributed. Okay, I drew this house bigger intentionally. See that it has an addition. This is the rich household. Now, most of us wouldn't want the rich household to get more of the permits in the first place. That would seem unfair. So one thing, and depending on how we do it, that could be the outcome. So it could be that if they form a government, people with more voice, more power, find a way to get more permits as they're initially distributed. And most of us don't feel too good about that. Or another thing that could be done is that instead of just distributing the permits, you auction them off. You sell the permits as a government. And you say, here's the first permit. Who wants to pay $10 for it? Who wants to pay 11? Who wants to pay 12? You sell off that permit. And you do that process for all 100 permits. And they're tradable. So if a person spent $12 for it and somebody else offers them 14 6 months later, they can sell it for 14 if they want to. Okay? But if you auction them off as a government, that does a couple things. It gives the permits to the highest bidder, which, yes, is very likely the rich household. But it also puts an economic value right on that permit, and it reduces the potential for an unethical distribution in the first place, because price is the rationing mechanism of those permits, because they're auctioned. They're not just distributed by whoever the mayor is who gives them to his or her friends. They're auctioned, okay? And that's, to me personally, that's very appealing, okay? There was another aspect of the auction that is important, and that is that it raises money. If they're just distributed, the government doesn't raise any money. But if you auction the permits, you raise money. So maybe if the scientists said it could sustain 100 sheep, and you auction the permits and raise money, perhaps it could sustain 110 because you could use the money to go ahead and grass seed the area or fertilize the area. Or maybe you just sell off the 100 and you use the revenue generated for the community to do something else, like build a school or something. Okay? But if you distribute them, there's no money raised for the government. So I'm going to hit pause on this for just a second and tell you where this has been attempted. In 2010, I think it was, the House of Representatives, the United States House of Representatives, passed a bill like this called Cap and Trade. Those were tradable permits on pollution emissions. And I went to town hall with my congressperson at the time, and I raised quite a fuss because he had voted for that bill, and the tradable permits were being distributed by the government, not auctioned. And I suspect some institutions had dibs on those permits rather than other institutions, maybe institutions that weren't as politically favorable to give those permits to. And it really bothers me that that bill that passed the House but didn't go any further had no provision to have those permits auctioned. The congressperson replied to me and said, well, that was done to lower the cost. We want to lower the cost. No, you don't do one of these things to lower the cost of having the sheep, of getting the permit to have the sheep on the common area. The sheep are destructive. You want it to cost something. You don't do it to lower the cost. That doesn't make any sense. That's why it wasn't because of me raising the fuss. It was because of duplicitous answers like that that congressperson only served one term. So anyway, that's a soapbox. So back to where I was. So we have two major ways to address this: collaboration, really three ways: do nothing, okay? Collaboration, which could include taxing the sheep, or preferably taxing how much the sheep eats, an individual sheep. Or we could have a cap and trade kind of permit system, a tradable permit system, which can also raise money for the common good. We could just have a simple quota system. I don't really go into that too much, other than what I did already, because it doesn't yield much innovation. By the way, if you could if you could put the tradable permit on how much a sheep eats using that scheme, it would also incentivize having sheep that eat less. It would incentivize innovation. I don't know how a sheep could really eat less. Perhaps there's some breeds of sheep that do and still yield a lot of wool. I don't know. But again, we're talking about something related more broadly than just sheep. So if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, they can measure how much comes out of a smokestack, and you put a permit, you require the carbon emission permit to be on how much comes out of a smokestack. And by doing that, since it costs money to have that permit, firms are motivated to find ways to produce the good with less emissions so they can sell off those permits and make money on permits rather than pay for them. So it inspires innovation. The taxes can do that too if you can tax the damage that the thing does. It also inspires innovation because people don't want to pay those taxes, right? So those are the collaborative sort of collective good approaches to addressing the tragedy of the commons. Then there's another approach to this that I would call much more about the individual than the collective good. It still remedies the tragedy of the commons, but it's sort of a different direction, and I want to present it that way. I try to make this interesting. I think it's a little more interesting. Rather than do something as a collective good, what you could do collectively is say, no, the problem is that this is a common resource. Let's just do away with that problem and establish property rights. Because see, if property rights are established, and this household owns this parcel of land, and this household owns, let's say, this parcel of land, and this household owns that parcel of land, and you divide up the land into private property. Now what happens if somebody puts too many sheep on his or her land? It only damages his or her land. So because you own the land and you own the problems that you create, if things can be structured that way, you are disincentivized from destroying what is yours. And if you can figure out a way for your sheep to eat less and still yield a high amount of wool, then you figure out how to do that. And then you might sell that idea to your neighbor. And everybody learns how to do that. And now you have sheep that are less damaging to what was the common area, but is now the private areas. So by establishing property rights, you do what's called internalize the externality. You make the externality the problem of the property owner, not a common problem. So that's my take on the tragedy of the commons and my little soapbox on a related real-life issue. I hope you enjoyed it.